Revelation 2464. From the 3rd of September 1942. Clairvoyant. Good or bad powers. Which spiritual forces make themselves known to people, if their working is openly apparent, must be seriously examined by those who think justly and want to walk in truth. There is a connection between heaven and earth, that is between this world and the beyond, which need never be interrupted if the human being is willing to maintain it. And indeed, the otherworldly forces always express themselves through those people who comply with their will, who are therefore of the same spirit, so to speak. Thus the luminous spiritual will always express itself through noble, good people. The dark forces, on the other hand, will make use of people who are dark in spirit, who are incapable of any good impulse, for they are also willing to serve the evil forces, thus they willingly carry out what they demand of them. But these evil forces will never be able to approach people whose nature is good, that is turned towards God. There is no power which is so strong that it could displace the spiritual beings of light. But the beings of light are constantly at the side of the God-oriented person, and thus the dark powers have no access, which is why an evil being in the beyond could never express itself through a person who only strives for the good and whose way of life reveals good, noble impulses. The gift of clairvoyance is an expression of spiritual powers in the beyond. That is, the human being is given enlightenment through knowing spiritual beings about things which the human being cannot otherwise fathom because they are beyond his examination or knowledge in terms of time or space. Thus the human being who is able to see such things has a strength at his disposal which is not inherent to him as a human being, and this strength is supplied to him from the spiritual kingdom. The spiritual beings have this knowledge at their disposal as soon as it concerns things which still belong to earth, and therefore they can give information to people on earth, because they are not hindered temporally and spatially. Thus, since they are no longer physically hindered, they can turn to where these earth-bound beings, be they human beings or dead objects on earth, are staying and thus mentally give information to the person questioning them. All that is needed on the part of the human being is a refined receptivity of his senses in order to be able to receive these explanations, and he can switch on this intensified sensory activity at any time, thus concentrate on receiving the mental whispers from the spiritual world. Thus the human being must for the first time acknowledge spiritual forces with which he can connect at will. But as long as only purely earthly things are to be clarified, which have nothing to do with the higher development of the soul, the clairvoyant does not need to show a high spiritual maturity either, but merely the recognition of spiritual powers and the use of them through the willingness to listen to their whisperings is sufficient. But then he is never certain that he will also be considered by forces which are still imperfect, and that errors will therefore also occur. But the results will always be striven for out of earthly interests, but spiritual progress will never be achieved. The latter depends on the degree of maturity of the one who can see hidden things. If he himself is deeply spiritually attuned, then he will also be able to spiritually influence the people who make use of his help. Then he will have a wealth of knowledge at his disposal, and he will use this knowledge for the salvation of his fellow human being's soul. For then he will also be supported by beings of light when he tries to fathom things that would otherwise remain hidden from people. Amen.